here today. And the main theme to ask everyone if we could please rise as we stand to attention for both the national anthem of the Republic of South Africa and the African Union. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you for the correction, Honorable Maimane. Thank you so much.
Good day, leaders. The real Africa is the one that they never show you. The real Africa is hidden beneath poverty and hunger and death, a cancerous mass on the face of the earth that the rest of the world term homogeneous Africa. The real Africa is submerged underneath corruption and crime and a tyranny of the ostentatious elite, underneath the faces of the people that they cannot lead. The real Africa is buried under shanty towns rife with disease and dirt, where children are brought up too quickly to survive. The real Africa is underneath a nomad's desert, bare and dry and unable to sustain healthy life. No, that is not the real Africa. The Africa I know is reflected in the warm sunshine that you can feel burning inside of you. The Africa that you can feel with a warm, spontaneous smile. The Africa that is at the heart of sky-high mountains, that you can see in tropical jungles, and you can see in golden dunes, that sustains healthy life and grasslands. The Africa that is at the heart of different people, from different cultures, different identities, that all call this land their home. The land where moyo muti unomera puando, where people take hold of the roots and don't let go, that they stay solid like the baobab tree, that always has been and always will be, that stands strong against the menace of time. My Africa is where my heart resides, even when I am long and gone and far away, where my mind wanders across the never-ending ocean. The real Africa can be smelt the minute you step off of the plane and feel the air calling you, beckoning you home. The real Africa is the chaos and the calm existing parallel as cars zoom past on the streets, parallel to the cows grazing in the grassland. This is the real Africa, the Africa that they never show. This is the place that I call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory Sang, one of our young leaders, part of YBM. Thank you so much for that rendition. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to welcome immediately onto the stage our deputy leader, co-founder of Bold One South Africa, Honorable Mother of the Nation, not too young. Let's put our hands together for Honorable Nobuntu Hlatsel-Webster.
The situation is not quite for heels. Good morning. Good morning, Sanbonani Jambo Mbote, and a happy Africa Day to everybody. I want to thank and acknowledge all the guests that are here today. I want to thank members of the media. I want to thank our diplomatic corps that are here today, members of academia. I want to thank friends of Build One South Africa, business leaders that are here with us today. And I especially want to acknowledge and thank our leader, Dr. Mmusi Maimane, for gathering and convening us here today on Africa Day, at a really critical time and moment in our country and on the continent. I haven't traveled this continent far enough, certainly not as much as I'd want to, but I have certainly been to the southern parts of our country. I've been to East Africa, I've been to West Africa, I've been to the northern parts of our continent as well. And whether you're in the southern parts of the continent, whether you're east, west, north, there are differences. You know, there's small cultural nuances that make us different. There's practices that are different, foods, music, with a unique beauty, language that differs, but there's something definitely shared that you can't miss in Africa, and that is the fact that across the continent, we're rich. We are rich in resources, we are rich in talent, we're rich in innovation, we're rich in resilience, we're rich in culture, we're rich in youth. Yet the one thing that we do share as a continent is that the people of the nations of Africa have not fully experienced the wealth that we hold. They haven't fully experienced this richness that we hold. But what that also means is that we're a continent of great potential, and we're a continent of immense possibility. And so the challenge for this generation is to not only speak about this potential that we have, but to get to a point where we finally realize it. And the one thing that is true, and I think that's important to remember, especially at this moment, is that we can only do that together. Through collaboration, we can do that through trade, we can do that through integration, we can do that through innovation, which is why at this time, it's increased tension, it's conflicts about immigration, about economic pressure, there's difficult conversations about African identity, about opportunity. Today matters. And it matters to, on Africa Day, remember that the future of this continent has always been tied together. In Nguni we say, umuntu ngubuntu ngabantu, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, and there's various different expressions of that across the continent. And so it's fitting that at this moment, we would have sober and forward-looking leadership that would convene us to have a discussion about the future of our continent. And it's fitting that it would be Dr. Mmusi Maimane who would convene us to have this conversation, because he's not only one of the most prominent voices in South African public life, in South African politics, but he's also a trusted voice on the future of democratic leadership in this country. A lot of South Africans will see Dr. Maimane on our screens, on various platforms in our country, but know less about the trusted voice that he is on the continent, that he represents a generation of African leadership that refuses to speak about Africa only through the lens of crisis, or to speak about Africa only through the lens of history, but instead speaks about and leads on Africa through the lens of possibility, of innovation and transformation. And so he's a respected African leader on global conversations about economic development on the continent, about leadership, about democracy in Africa, and increasingly represents African perspectives internationally. He's engaged with numerous initiatives across the continent, and he's focused on the development of emerging leaders across the continent, and this includes as leading and as inaugural president for the African Democratic Alliance for Freedom and Progress, which brings together political and civic leaders across the continent to build a more prosperous and democratic Africa, but to start to shape the kind of transformation and to shape the kind of dialogue and to shape the kind of governance that we need in order to be able to realize this as a continent. And working with him, my experience is that this is someone who at all times champions the idea that Africa's future is not going to be built through isolation. It is going to be built through collaboration. It is going to be built through integrity. It is going to be built through courageous leadership, and the kind of leadership that's even willing to stand up and say the things that aren't popular in the moment to ensure that we not only survive as a continent, but that we grow and we reach our potential. Most importantly, he represents a generation that is determined to ensure that Africa's potential is no longer a slogan. We've been saying, Africa, your time is now, Africa, rise, but it has to become a reality. It has to be more than a slogan. He is committed to ensuring that he works with other leaders on the continent and in this country for a reality that is experienced by the African people of an Africa rising and of it being our time now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mmusi Maimane.
Please, you may be seated. Our program director, members of the diplomatic corps, members of the media who are here, honored guests, fellow South Africans. It is indeed our great honor and privilege to be able to deliver this lecture on Africa Day about Africa rising. And that will be the focus of my discussion today. It does pain me slightly, but necessary for South Africa, that I congratulate Mamelodi Sundowns for being continental champions. I think it's befitting that on this Africa Day, the trophy comes back to South Africa. Even more painful would be to congratulate Orlando Pirates. The other team from Soweto for winning the domestic cup. Philosophically speaking, I think when Pirates win, it's a triumph against capital. It's the same that's happened in England, where one team beat another one with lots of money. But fellow South Africans, we gather today, and I was reminded by the words that were penned down in 1979 by the prolific poet Nwapile Matingwana, who dismantled the misplaced notion of Afrophobia masquerading as xenophobia. In his seminal piece, he said, "Africa my beginning, Africa my ending." He writes with piercing clarity. In his words, he says, and I quote, "They asked Mugabe, 'What do you want here, my brother?' He said, 'All Africans are my brothers.' Not some Africans, all Africans. Not Africans of convenience, but all Africans." 47 years later, Matingwana's sharp lyrical truth still resonates powerfully with us. as we witness in many ways charlatans who distort bigotry into patriotism and use it as a justification to brutalize fellow Africans on the South African soil. societies. This creates what economists often describe as a population dividend or a demographic dividend. It is conditional upon education systems that function, labor markets that absorb skills, and economies that grow at scale. Over the next coming decade, Africa's demographic profile will shape the global labor market, consumption patterns, and economic growth. Yet, despite all of this potential, Africa continues to occupy a disproportionately small portion within the global economy. Africa accounts for just 3% of global trade, and our combined GDP remains smaller than that of some of the individual states in sectors like the United States. So if we live in a continent of more than 1 billion people, still accounts for only a modest share of the global economy in terms of its own trade and output. We often in our continent speak of regional integration and continental unity, yet so many of our commitments remain words on paper. I want to reflect freshly on the African Union's Agenda 2063, which was meant to chart a pathway to prosperity. But it has been entrusted to a few who failed to implement, who failed to meet their targets, who failed to be held accountable. So in reflection of all of these, when you look at the Jubilees Commission led by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and sanctioned by the late Pope Francis, nearly 3 in 5 Africans live in countries spending more on debt repayments than on education and healthcare. To pay external creditors, African nations are often forced to sacrifice investment in schools, in hospitals, in infrastructure, and climate resilience. Much of the debt is rooted in the legacy of colonialism. Africa cannot fully develop while chained to perpetual debt. The global West must support meaningfully debt relief in the continent, and we must help unlock the continent's future. Africa does not lack talent, does not lack resources, does not lack ambition. Often what it lacks is execution on the part of leadership. So we are not going to rise through slogans. We only can do so through trade, through growth, through infrastructure, through education, and leadership that is committed to real progress for its own future. If I think about South Africa, our native land, South Africa's debt to GDP is projected to peak at 77%. But in truth, when you think about what that means, it means that for every 1 rand that comes into our fiscus, 23 cents of it is spent on debt servicing costs. Were we to reduce our debt servicing costs, how much more could we invest in education, in healthcare, and many other things? So whilst this country of ours is deemed by many of our African brothers as the big brother, we have to take that role seriously and lead out of it. We are the most industrialized and economically the most sophisticated country in the continent. But as a result, South Africa has become an attractive destination and a home to many people from many African nations. At the same time as all of that attraction and sophistry, we must reflect honestly about the hardships that too many South Africans face. Economic growth remains perpetually low. It hardly reaches 1% of growth. There is indeed a shortage of housing, pressure on healthcare facilities, rising unemployment, and growing insecurity amongst many communities. It is common cause. Communities, in the absence of leadership, are left abandoned. It is getting hard to live in South Africa. I don't want to deny that government in this regard has failed the basic task of governing. There's no denial about the fact that when there are not enough beds at Charlotte Maxeke, life is hard. There's no denial about the fact that when crime levels go up and there's no justice, life is hard. And I want to acknowledge equally so that South Africa is in the throes of trying to manage its own migration crisis. Having said that, hatred of fellow Africans will not solve our healthcare crisis. Xenophobia will not create jobs. Violence against immigrants will not restore safety in our communities. I say this. It would suit the government for us to keep talking about and focused on xenophobia, because whilst we are blaming the other, they will not be held accountable for failing our hospitals, failing our schools, and not being able to provide safety for our people. We must. If we are to march, we must march to the government and we must hold them accountable for their failure to manage our healthcare systems, our education systems, and yes, for their failure to manage our borders. Yes, their failure to avail centers upon which those who enter South Africa can do so to find legality. We must hold them accountable for underfunding the Border Management Authority. But we equally must hold them accountable for failing to uphold the basic laws of this country. You see, because if we don't attend to this question as to who's accountable for what, we are going to soon be electing leaders who will stand up on a populist rant. I call them the Abahambe Brigade. We will elect them, put them in office on the back of that issue. And as a result, they will fail to govern. And we will wonder why. Because they were never genuine about dealing with the issues of the country. They were only genuine about scapegoating other people at our expense. To enforce laws properly. Because ultimately, if we fail to do that job, corruption weakens our institutions, ultimately our economy would stagnate, and then before we know it, we will have to find more others to blame. When they are done with the immigrants, they will come for the Tsonga South Africans. They will go to Tswana South Africans. They will go to English South Africans. They'll go to Afrikaans South Africans. And as the saying goes, eventually they will come for you. And when they come for you, there'll be no one else left to speak up for you. Today on Africa Day, we really need to be honest. We cannot speak honestly about Africa's future without attending and confronting this ugliest and most self. They said, I'm not talking to South Africans. My brother, you were telling me earlier that they'd booked up an event in Rwanda. And when they were in Rwanda, the halls were empty because there were South African artists performing there. Surely that must signal to us that we are part of this continent and we need to find our story as part of this continent. You see, when attending to the question of immigration, you can't be stuck in opposite polarization. At one, there are others who talk, we are borderless, we must just go. And then on another side, there are those who are caught up in the extreme of let's build a wall and ask Zimbabweans to pay for it. It doesn't attend to the question of how we attend to this issue of immigration. And then you got others who believe the answer is in hatred, in scapegoating, in violence against immigrants. Both positions, I would argue, are intellectually inadequate. The first ignores the strain on public service and administrative system, and the second goes against the moral and constitutional obligations that define a democratic society. A mature response needs to take cognizance of both and deal with a migration that is regulated and upholding the human dignity of all people. I repeat, xenophobia is an antithesis to Ubuntu. And let me make this point. South Africans, in the main, are not xenophobic. It's common cause, I supported Kaizer Chiefs. These have been very difficult days for us. But I grew up watching Oscar Ratintwa from Swaziland. Many Zimbabwean players played for Kaizer Chiefs. In fact, I think even Sundowns has some strikers now who come from Namibia. Orlando Pirates has got Hotto. Yet, when you go to a stadium, South Africans will cheer these players on. How can you say those South Africans who were cheering those Africans are the same ones who, when they leave the stadiums, want to kill them? So we must interrogate where these forces who are marching and killing immigrants are coming from, because they misrepresent you and I. We must interrogate this issue. That's why the failure of Minister Nchaveni in attending to the intelligence and following up where these attacks are coming from, we must hold her accountable to make sure that she deals with the intelligence so that we avoid violence in our society. That is a government failure. It does not represent the character of our people. Our people have got hardships. There's no denying that. Our job is to help work with those hardships. Because for too many South Africans, they are clear that they don't want places like Little Lagos. Because let me tell you, when you go down the road here in the city of Johannesburg, and you find areas where they have been captured, quote unquote, the dilemma with what happens there is that when immigrants move into a space and they occupy it, and other people move out of that city, the municipality does not enforce bylaws because suddenly they are not dealing with South Africans. So you have a different problem on your hands. Because when there's overcrowding, when there's no collection of refuse, electricity, water, all of those things, the city does not hold itself accountable because it's now Little Lagos or whatever the place might be. I want to challenge us to say, let us enforce our laws. Let's ensure that South Africans, in the main, remain in spaces, because there's a housing availability, city of Johannesburg, wherever the case might be, that we must be able to restore and allow for citizens to come and stay there. So I don't agree with all of these fresh movements, because all over the world we're seeing that xenophobia is not just a uniquely South African issue. We're seeing some of the instincts happen even in the US against some of the Mexicans. We're seeing some of it take place in Europe, where you're finding some Europeans against Arabs. We're seeing in parts such as Australia, where there seems to be an attitude against Asians. So when we say we must be fellow Africans, we must remind ourselves of the work that Steve Biko challenged us to do, which is to give the world a far more human face. So we can't be reduced to intellectually lazy arguments who deal with symptoms, but never with the root causes of the issue, who reduce extraordinarily economically and complex issues into sloganeering, who fail to hold the governments accountable and create a danger in our society. Fellow Africans, I want to state it quite clearly and quite categorically that if you look at our labor market system, migration alone cannot explain structural unemployment. Even the spaza shop in the communities, surely in response to that question, aren't we learning bulk buying so that we can support South African entrepreneurs? South African unemployment crisis predates current migration. It is driven in many ways by low growth, by skills mismatches, and lack of investment and declining industrial absorption capacity. So when leaders redirect efforts, they fail to attend to these questions. My fear, that's why we founded BOSA. Because I believe in BOSA, we can truly build one South Africa. That's my belief. You can't build social cohesion while you are consumed with scapegoating. You simply can't. And if we are honest, we must reject some simplistic narratives that have been set there. This issue of xenophobia is not a race issue. It's a governance issue. It's a resource issue. It's a regulatory failure. It's a failure of border management. It's a failure of urban planning. It's a failure of economic growth. And it's a failure of state capacity. Never shall it be that in this country we'll have no-go areas. Never shall it be that if you build a government, we should have areas of cities that are for only certain races or people. I believe in an immigration policy that integrates people. I don't believe in those countries who build camps outside their cities. I believe the fact that if you want to come into South Africa, you must do so legally, you must learn South African ways, you must learn South African languages, and in that instance, you become integrated in the context of the country you live in. It would be true anywhere else I would go to. I also want to be clear that employers who exploit the vulnerabilities of migrants for cheap labor, underpaying them, abusing them, and using them, desperation to drive down standards for everybody, this also we must denounce. It's a distortion of the labor market system that ultimately house South Africa. There are some employers across South Africa who simply say, when we hire South Africans, they disappear. I want to say to those employers, let's fix our education system so that we have citizens who are disciplined, who can show up for work, do the work that they need to do. We have to build a prosperous society. And if we're honest about our cultural and economic behaviors, we can then begin to build trust in our continent. So if you are an undocumented migrant in this country, I want to say this to you plainly. If you want to live in South Africa, you must do so legally and abide to the laws of this country. You must do so, and I think it's a position that is well accepted by African diplomats, that you must be documented, you must remain in the country. And we, as a government, must make it easier for registration of immigrants so that they can be here legally. We gather here at Constitution Hill. And many people say our constitution is a problem. They blame Section 27, which states that it guarantees the realization of healthcare, housing, food, water, and social security for everyone. And they focus on the word everyone. You know, when I was in attending to a hospital that was undercapacitated, they say Section 27 is our problem because it says everyone, which means everyone comes in and they have children in our hospital. But it's a misinterpretation of Section 27. Section 27 of our Constitution presumes legal rights. It presumes that everyone is here legally. You can't blame the Constitution for when you've looted Tembisa and you've stolen and people don't have basic medication. You say, no, it's because of Section 27 and everyone coming in. Actually, it's not. It's because you stole, you killed whistleblowers, and those people must be held accountable for the failure of our healthcare system, not Section 27 of the Constitution. It's clear when you read the Constitution, it uses terms like every citizen, every person, and everyone interchangeably, assuming legality. How can a legal document enhance illegality? So government cannot be let off the hook on this issue. It must manage its healthcare. It must manage education. And it must do so to ensure that we live in a country in which laws are upheld. Our problem isn't migration. We have benefited from migration. Some industries would never have been developed in South Africa if it wasn't for migration. Our businesses are trading in other parts. You go to Ghana, you will become surprised. You will see ShopRite there. You go to other parts, you see South African businesses. You see our pay systems. This is part of the continent that we live in. So we have to be clear that the integration of the continent and its legality is an important job in and of itself, because a market of 1.2 or 1.4 billion people by the middle of the century is surely a better and a bigger market than that of 64 million South Africans. Fellow Africans, if we are going to deal with the question of migration and immigration, we must also deal with the governments where people come from. And at this point, I want to highlight, I was speaking to my friend in Zimbabwe, Tendai Biti. He's a lawyer, worked in finance. Today, they've taken Tendai Biti's passport. If he wants to travel anywhere, he has to go back to the court to get the passport and then travel and then come back. All because he holds a different view to the government. So yes, I read in a newspaper that some of the ambassadors had boycotted one of the other functions. I say to them, that's the correct stance to take. But if you are going to continue with the same stance, take the same strong stance when Emmerson Mnangagwa rigs elections in Zimbabwe, locks away opposition leaders. We must be as adamant about that issue situation as we are about where South Africa is at. Because you can't allow an undemocratic regime in Zimbabwe to continue functioning in that manner and not hope to be able to deal with the economic crisis that we face. Liberation movements often, at first, as many Kenyans say, they liberate us. And it's only a matter of time before they themselves, in certain instances, become the oppressors of the people. That's why it is always true. At first we must be liberated, and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators. What we don't need is more strong men. I know there's a populist rise that says, I wish we had a dictator. It does not last. Studies indicate that democratic states tend to, over a long period of time, demonstrate higher levels of growth. But maybe the appetite for dictators is because governments fail. We must build strong institutions that deliver in the continent. It's why I am working hard in the founding of the African... We started the African Democratic Alliance of Political Parties for Freedom and Progress. That alliance constitutes within it 45 parties, and it is built on democratic movements from 25 African countries. We share this shared belief that Africa's future will not be built through ethnic nationalization, authoritarianism, or despots, or dependency. Instead, it will be built through democratic governance, political accountability, economic inclusion, and human dignity. I want to argue it's within these parties that are going to implement and see through the vision of Africa 2063. So, fellow Africans, let's be clear-eyed. The challenges we face actually demand action. So there are a few steps I want to put before you. At first, we must strengthen our capacity. We have to be able to build more asylum centers and refugee centers so that there are only 5 in the country, by the way. We need more strengthened so that people can do so legally. Because, Roger, I was talking to someone this morning. I love South Africa. I love living in South Africa. I'm sure Zimbabweans love Zimbabwe. They love living in Zimbabwe. I'm sure Zambians likewise. I'm sure Nigerians likewise. So we must ensure that in the process of legality, people can come in, visit if they want. If they want to go back home, they can do so freely, because the last thing you want is for people not having legal certainty when they're in the country. All that perpetuates is a fear that were they to leave, when they come back, they won't be able to come in again. People are proud. I meet Kenyans who are proud of being Kenyans. So we must strengthen this part. It's not about ever closing our doors. It's about ensuring that we are clear about who is in the country and for what purpose. We must be clear. We must legalize. We must ensure that budgets are allocated properly. Furthermore, we must ensure that our borders are better managed. I would argue we must do better to fund border management. If it means that we must take the budget from VIP protection, which is 4 billion rands, and give 2.2 billion rands to border management agency, then we must do that. The issue isn't about whether or not it's the fact that we protect politicians, not our people. So if we strengthen that component, it's not just only managing how people come in and out. Border management is also about thermal scanners to make sure you manage how people come in. If you can detect that someone has a particular virus, you are able to deal. It's about making sure you deal with how animals are moved, how goods are moved. We can't talk about illicit trade and many of those things, yet underfund border management and allow for certain ministers to put fences there that are like little wires, and then we say we've protected our borders. What nonsense is that? We have to put technology, drones, all of the above. It would be true if I arrived in Ghana, the same must be upheld. It would be true if I arrived anywhere else. They must uphold their rule of law. Progressive countries now are starting to adjudicate visas online so that there's movement of people, and I would argue, particularly in the SADC region, we must be better at it. We must modernize our economic competitiveness. Recently, we lost, as South Africans, our ability in the automotive sector. We lost it to Morocco. They are now the #1 sector. We can reclaim that by modernizing our system so that we can become the net exporter of vehicles from South Africa to other parts of Africa. We must have a rating agency here in Africa. See, Dr. Falala is here. This is an important battle. It will make sure the cost of capital in the continent is reflected accurately and being used correctly. These aren't simply technical issues. They're about giving life to how we ensure that actually South Africa does not become an exporter of raw materials and labor, but it becomes a place of prosperity. Fourthly, we must lead with vision, not with isolation. South Africa must do more through the continent. We need a business visa framework that makes it easy for people to get there, particularly within the SADC region. In fact, I would argue visas from Lesotho must be adjudicated in Pretoria. Lesotho is within our own borders. We can deal with that issue. We must use our customs union more effectively, and ultimately we must ensure that our diplomacy opposes authoritarianism in the continent, and we must stand up for citizens. I was in Parliament when Omar al-Bashir was left out. We can't afford that. We must strengthen our ability to hold. So as I draw this to a conclusion, this is not a theoretical exercise. It must be us ensuring that we heal the physical fractures within our communities, strengthen our institutions, and make sure in our public discourse we lead citizens. We can no longer afford to have these approaches in fragments, and that migration is isolated from economic growth, and that xenophobia is isolated from governance failure, and that border management is an isolation from social cohesion. These are interconnected realities produced by single underlying conditions, the strength or the weakness of the state itself. This is a moment for us as South Africa, that we must choose between competing values. If we are to learn, we must hold these truths. We must hold ourselves to be disciplined. We must uphold the constitutional imperative of human dignity without compromise. We must enforce the law consistently without fear or favor. We must ensure that every citizen is here and enjoys legal status. We must confront economic stagnation and an urgency it demands, because no society will remain cohesive under these conditions. This is harder than just slogans. It actually requires the hard work of building infrastructure that makes it easy for me to move a set of goods from here to Liberia, to Morocco, to Ghana, to Kenya, than it is for me to move goods to China. You know, I'm in the moment right now planning a trip to Liberia. I have to travel for so long in the same continent, it would be easier for me to get to England or to get to another part. That can't be. If we're going to integrate this continent, we must make it easy for people to travel within the continent. It will require us to be honest. It will require our citizens to work with us. And it will require us to build competence in our institution. South Africa's future is linked to that of the African continent. Africa Day must remind us that our destiny is not isolated, that our stability is built through regional stability, that our prosperity is linked to regional prosperity, that our independence must be matched by responsibility. Responsibility to build a state that works, an economy that grows, and a society that remains anchored by both justice and realism. If we succeed in realizing this tension, we will expand possibility. We will replace fear with confidence. We will replace fragmentation with cohesion and stagnation with progress. Africa's geographical position in a world of geopolitics has never been better. Now is the time for us to build an Africa that leads. Fellow Africans, we have to cooperate in a defense manner. Because ultimately we're seeing that as the world is becoming unsafe, you may find instability that happens through outside actors, whether those are actors of terror, those are actors who abduct young girls, or whether any of those actors requires us to work together as the continent. So those who make the absolute call, Africa maibuye, they were calling for Africa's return, not so that Africa can be only for some and not for others, but that the Africa maibuye must be building a strong, a united, and a prosperous Africa. Fellow Africans, if we fail, we will not fail because the challenges are known. We will fail because we fail to do the hard yards of building this continent. So on this Africa Day, let us recommit ourselves, particularly as South Africans, to build a continent that is prosperous, an Africa that is united, and a society that ultimately takes its rightful role of playing a leading role within the continent. I thank you. Asante sana. God bless you.
Thank you, Honorable Dr. Maimane, for the presentation and the words that were shared, and I think seeds that have been planted to stir thinking beyond today. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm going to allow we are honored to have our media, friends from the media as well. If there are any specific questions directed to Dr. Maimane from the media, if you could please indicate, we'll allow for that facilitation to take place if there are any. If not, then we will proceed to have a 15-minute Q&A session with the audience itself. We don't want to rob you from the opportunity to engage and interact questions that you might have pertaining to what was presented. So if I can just get an indication perhaps from the media, any questions, specific questions? I think SABC, you guys are covered. I don't see him in the room at the moment. Is there anyone else from the media? Sure. If you could just give your name and which media house you represent and go for it. Could you perhaps just come a bit forward just to speak up so we can capture your question? Thanks so much.
Sure. There's nothing that stops the government from taking action. Anyone who wants to blame the laws of the country fails to appreciate the fact that if you want to take action, let's assume you want to secure your borders. That is about passing a law of making sure an appropriation of 2.2 billion rands is allocated so that you can do two things. Move the number of police who are in our borders, particularly those who are corrupt, you remove those out. You take fresh number of policemen, you bring them on board. You introduce scanners, you introduce all of that. You use drone technology to make sure that your border infrastructure is secure. Second, in that matter, we have to deal with the development and state capacity. Citizens who are here and human beings who are in the country must be able to have centers upon which they can go and be registered. In the many instances, you find that people have been trying. They go to the Home Affairs, and the Home Affairs has only got 5 centers across the country that deal with refugee and asylum status. That surely is insufficient. So let's increase those numbers to make sure that there can be easier registration. But thirdly, I want to say this: we must create a registry so that we know where citizens are living, everywhere. To me, when you can make sure communities are safe, you make sure people do so legally, they register legally, that is within the capability of the state. There's no law. Section 27 doesn't even prohibit the work that we've got to do. So blaming of the law is scapegoating. It is a complete failure of governance. If you can't govern your own country, today you blame the law, tomorrow you blame the other, the list can carry on. Actually, you need to take a hard look at saying, the police, let me give you a real example. The police have got a deficit of 6,000 policemen currently. Since 2010 to in the decade that preceded after that, we underfunded the police to a point where the numbers decreased by 18,000. When you can't arrest a criminal, the conviction rate for murder is 1 in 5. So that's not an immigration problem or a law problem, it's a capacity problem. Deal with how the state functions. And then you become effective at that. So that anyone who is here knows so, they do so legally, and they uphold the laws of this country. If you are an immigrant and you break the law in this country, we will capacitate the budget to make sure you are arrested. Because no one must be allowed to break the law in this country. Both immigrants and South Africans. So that's a governance issue. And we scapegoat people and we say, go fight with those ones. So my brother, I want to urge us, it's important that we get, that is the point that we've got to get through. It doesn't take away from the challenges that citizens face. Communities have got problems, I get it. If you are running a spaza shop in our communities and you are distributing things that are not healthy, that don't meet health standards, we must attend to you legally. Uphold the laws that you have and stop blaming them. Because the problem with a failure of governance will soon blame the very laws that empowers it to do their job. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maimane. Media, sure. If you could please just stand and just your name and which media house.
Thank you so much. My name is Kutlwana Mloyi. I'm from the Independent Agency of African Intelligence. And we have a couple of questions for you, Maimane. But first of all, we just wanted to commend your work and everything you're doing. We think the work that Build One South Africa is doing to unify the country is absolutely, absolutely unbelievable. So the questions we have for you, right, is that first is about youth development and unemployment. We want to know from you, sir, what industries do you believe hold the biggest opportunities for young Africans over the next 10 years? And more of a business and economic question is, South Africa's small businesses struggle with regulation, access to markets. We want to know what reforms would Busa introduce to support SMEs? And lastly, sir, how can public-private partnerships better drive economic development in underdeserved communities? Thank you.
It's some important questions. First of all, I think economies. So let me start with this question, and I'm going to plagiarize what Dr. Falala challenges me all the time. The question for South Africa should be, how do we grow our economy in its current GDP of 7 trillion rand to become 16 trillion rand, which is the equivalent of 1 trillion US dollars? That's the philosophical question. Now, to get that right, you have to figure out quite quickly, when you look at the top 10 contributors to GDP, they take different. So the financial services sector is an important contributor. Automotive and manufacturing are key, that's fourth. Mining, as an example, is like ninth in the list. So if we're going to do that, we have to